Emily Carter brought the goats home on a gray April morning, when the clouds hung low enough to scrape the tops of the sycamores and the dirt road still held last night's rain in shallow brown ruts. Her old Ford came first, coughing over the hill with one cracked headlight and a tailgate tied shut with baling wire. Behind it rolled two rusted livestock trailers, both patched with mismatched panels, both groaning under the restless weight inside. The trailers were packed with goats, 312 of them, thin goats, sickly goats, goats with hollow flanks, dull eyes, rough coats, overgrown hooves, and ribs sharp enough to show through their hides when they turned sideways. By the time Emily reached the faded Carter Farm sign, the morning had gone still. A man repairing fence across the road stopped with his hammer in midair. The mail carrier slowed near the mailbox and stared through the windshield. Two boys on bicycles paused at the ditch, watching the animals shift and bleat inside the trailers. At the edge of the Carter property, Warren Pike stood beside his clean diesel truck with one boot on the running board, his arms folded, his face wearing the kind of pity that felt worse than laughter. Emily did not look at any of them. She climbed down from the Ford, boots landing in wet gravel, and walked to the first trailer latch. She was 24 years old, small-framed but strong from years of work, with brown hair tucked under a sun-faded cap and mud already drying on the cuffs of her jeans. Her hands were wrapped in old leather gloves. One glove had a split along the thumb. When she opened the trailer gate, the first goats did not charge out. They stumbled. A spotted nanny stepped down, shook on weak legs, and lowered her head, as if the ground itself surprised her. A young wether followed, limping slightly, his coat rubbed bare along one shoulder. Then more came, slow and uncertain, blinking at the farmyard, at the sagging barn, at the muddy lane leading toward the western pasture. That pasture had once carried cattle. Now it looked like a place the land had given up on. Blackberry cane twisted through the fence rows in thorned ropes. Multiflora rose in dense, cruel clumps. Thistles stood waist-high. Ragweed filled the open spots. Sericea lespedeza spread in bitter, wiry patches that cattle had refused year after year. Young cedar and brush crowded the slopes. The good grass underneath had thinned to pale threads, robbed of light, water, and space. Most people in the county no longer called it pasture. They called it junk ground. Some called it dead. Emily opened the gate to that field. The goats hesitated for only a minute. Then hunger overruled weakness. One by one, they moved into the weeds and began eating the very things that had ruined the Carter place. They pulled leaves from blackberry stems. They stood on hind legs to reach rose canes. They stripped green tips from brush. Their mouths worked steadily, not like animals entering a wasteland, but like workers arriving at a job. Emily stood beside the gate with a brown notebook in her hand. She wrote the date, April 12. She wrote the number, 312 head. She wrote the weather, cool, damp, no wind. Then she looked across the road, where the witnesses had begun to drift away, already carrying the story toward town. A young woman with no money had bought the worst goats at the sale. A failing cattle farm had become a sick goat pen. Daniel Carter's daughter had finally lost sense. Emily closed the gate, latched it twice, and did not explain a thing. Carter Farm had not always been a place people measured for failure. When Emily was little, the farm was 86 acres of rolling Missouri ground, red clay ridges, creek-bottom soil, hayfields, and pasture that smelled alive after rain. Her grandfather had bought the first 40 acres after years of working other men's land. Her father, Daniel, added the rest, acre by acre, never rich, never careless, always walking the fields as if every slope had a voice. Emily had learned the farm by following him. As a child, she rode on the tractor fender before she was supposed to. She watched him kneel in the pasture, crumble soil between his fingers, and lift it to his nose. She learned that dry soil could smell dusty or dead, and those were not always the same thing. She learned that water never simply disappeared. It ran, settled, hid, or was stolen by roots deeper and greedier than grass. She learned that a fence line told the truth about a farmer long before a bank statement did. Then the hard years came without mercy. First came drought, 2 summers of it. Hay prices rose, pastures burned down, and Daniel sold more cattle than he wanted to admit. Then the old John Deere began failing in pieces: a starter, a hydraulic hose, a cracked radiator. Each repair took money from another place that needed it. The north fence leaned until calves found weakness in it. The barn roof opened along one seam, and rain began falling into the loft. The western pasture grew brushier each year, and each year Daniel said he would clear it when the money came back. The money did not come back. Then, in February, Daniel had a stroke in the hallway outside the kitchen. He survived, but the stroke took strength from his right side and stole ease from his speech. He came home from the hospital with a cane, a stack of medical bills, and a silence that settled over the farmhouse heavier than winter. The man who had once fixed gates in the dark and lifted feed sacks without thinking now needed both hands to button his shirt. Emily moved back the same week. She left her rented room 30 miles away, left her part-time job at the co-op office, and came home to a farm already behind on the note. The bank had not been cruel, it had been worse than cruel, it had been precise. Carter Farm owed $96,400 on the operating line and equipment note combined. The bank had already rolled missed interest once. The last calf crop had brought in less than expected. The cattle herd had been reduced too far to carry the farm through another year. The bank wanted a payment of $18,700 by the end of summer, plus proof that the farm could generate enough revenue to justify keeping the line open. Emily had 90 days to present a workable cash flow plan. Not hope, not family history, not photographs of better years. Numbers. The bank officer had said the words carefully, but Emily understood what they meant. If she could not show income, land would have to be sold. Warren Pike had already offered to buy the western pasture for less than it was worth, because everyone knew the Carters were weak. He called it taking a problem off her hands. Emily called it cutting the heart out of the farm and asking the body to keep walking. Her father never told her not to sell. That was what hurt most. He sat at the kitchen table one evening, his right hand curled stiffly near the edge, his left hand resting on a stack of old pasture maps. He tried to turn one page and could not get the corner loose. Emily reached to help, but he pulled his hand back, stubborn even in weakness. After a long moment, he managed it himself. The map beneath showed the western pasture the way it had been in her childhood, divided by clean fence lines, shaded along the creek, marked with grass notes in Daniel's handwriting. Emily watched him touch that field with one finger. Not the house, not the barn, not the smaller hay meadow. The western pasture, the worst land they had, the land everyone wanted her to sell. That night, after he went to bed, Emily opened the roll-top desk in the back room to look for old bank papers. In the bottom drawer, beneath seed catalogs, tax receipts, and brittle envelopes, she found 2 notebooks. One had belonged to her grandfather, one had belonged to her father. Her grandfather's notebook was rough and simple, written in block letters with pencil darkened by age, rainfall, calving dates, fence repairs, pasture notes. Then, halfway through, a section about goats. Before the Carters had enough cattle, her grandfather had used goats to clean brush from the creek bank in Westfield. He wrote that they ate leaves, vines, thorn tips, young cedar, and bitter weeds that cows stepped around. He wrote that cattle grazed like a mower, but goats worked like fingers. Emily read that line 3 times. Her father's notebook gave the same story in a different language. It listed the invasion year by year. Sericea spreading on the south slope. Blackberry thickening after the dry summer. Multiflora rose choking the lower fence. Mowing delayed because the tractor failed. Herbicide priced too high. Brush clearing quoted at more than the farm could carry. On the last page, Daniel had written that the western pasture was not dead. It was covered. It needed the right pressure at the right time. The right pressure. Emily sat under the kitchen light until after midnight, reading both notebooks while the house creaked around her. By morning, she had made a list. By the end of the week, She had driven 2 counties south to a dispersal sale where a neglected goat herd was being sold cheap because nobody wanted to spend money bringing it back. That was how 312 sickly goats came to Carter Farm. The county laughed before the animals had finished their first week. At the feed store, the story followed Emily down every aisle. Men glanced at the dewormer in her basket, the mineral blocks, the temporary fence insulators, the hoof trimmers, and the marked-down bags of feed she could barely afford. Their faces said she was treating disaster with more disaster. At the diner, her name moved between coffee cups and plates of eggs. People remembered Daniel as a good cattleman. That made Emily's decision look even worse. To them, goats were not a plan. They were what someone bought when they could not afford real livestock. The bank heard too. When Emily brought in her first revised budget, the officer studied the goat purchase line longer than any other number. He did not mock her. He simply asked for expected revenue, expected death loss, veterinary costs, fencing cost, sale timeline, and a conservative estimate of weight gain. Emily had answers, but some were still projections. The bank accepted the papers without accepting the idea. The county agent visited in late April. He walked the western pasture with her, stepping over temporary wire and broken stems. He was polite, but his eyes kept returning to the weak goats, the rough fence, the overloaded brush, and the young woman trying to make one risky solution answer 5 separate problems. Emily showed him her paddock plan. She had divided the pasture into small cells, using step-in posts and portable electric fence. The goats would hit one patch hard, then move. Each section would rest. The brush would be weakened, not scraped bare. Manure would go back to the soil. Light would return to the ground. The agent took notes, but caution remained in his face. Emily was used to that. The goats tested her from the beginning. Some arrived carrying heavy parasite loads. Some needed hoofwork. Some were too weak to compete at mineral tubs. Emily sorted them into groups, gave the worst animals extra care, and turned the old machine shed into a dry pen with salvaged gates and straw she could hardly spare. On the 9th day, 7 goats found a low place under the temporary fence and scattered into the farmyard. No row of laughing trucks came this time. The humiliation was quieter and sharper. Emily spent 2 hours in the rain catching them alone while her father watched from the porch, gripping his cane so hard his knuckles went white. When she finally brought the last goat back, soaked and bleeding from blackberry scratches, she found him at the bottom of the porch steps. He should not have been there. The steps were slick, his bad leg trembled. One hand held the rail, the other clutched an old pair of fencing pliers. Emily crossed the yard fast, angry from fear, before she was angry at him. He could barely stand steady, yet he had dragged himself outside because he could not bear watching her fight the farm alone. She took the pliers from him. His fingers resisted for 1 second, then released. Neither of them said what they were both feeling. She helped him back to the porch, sat beside him on the wet step, and the two of them looked toward the western pasture where the goats had begun eating again as if nothing had happened. Rain moved through the weeds in silver threads. Daniel's breath came unevenly. Emily's arms shook from exhaustion. After a while, her father reached over with his good hand and tapped the notebook sticking from her back pocket. It was not permission exactly. It was not confidence either. It was a request. Keep records. Prove it. From then on, Emily treated every day like evidence. She weighed sample groups every 2 weeks, using a borrowed scale from a neighbor who still believed she would fail, but did not want to see animals suffer. She marked each paddock by date and size. She recorded which weeds were eaten first, which needed a second pass, which goats gained fastest, which ones stayed wormy despite treatment. She logged rainfall, feed costs, mineral use, fence failures, medicine, deaths, labor hours, and regrowth. 3 goats died in the first month. Emily buried them beyond the shed under a cedar tree. She wrote the tag numbers in the notebook because pretending losses did not count would make the rest of the numbers worthless. Her father came out that evening, slowly, with his cane sinking into soft ground. He stood by the cedar while Emily packed soil over the last small grave. He did not comfort her with false hope. He bent carefully, picked up a handful of soil with his good hand, and let it fall through his fingers. The ground was dark beneath the cedar needles, covered, cool, not exposed. Emily watched the gesture and understood why he had brought her there. The farm was still teaching, even in grief. May passed into June. The goats improved by inches. Their coats began to fill. Their eyes brightened. Their ribs softened under new weight. The western pasture looked worse from a distance before it looked better. Brush stood ragged where leaves had been stripped. Thorn stems leaned broken. Trampled weeds lay flattened in mats. Manure dotted the ground. People saw ugliness. Emily saw light touching soil. Under the brush, grass shoots appeared. Not enough to save the farm yet, not enough to impress a banker, but enough to mark with orange flags and photograph every week from the same fence post. Her father began helping in the only ways his body allowed. He could not rebuild fence, but he could sit at the kitchen table and check her math. His handwriting had changed after the stroke, smaller and uneven, but he could still circle a number that did not make sense. Emily brought him receipts, weight logs, and pasture maps. He used a ruler to help her calculate cost per pound gained. He marked which paddocks had rested long enough and which needed more time. When speech failed him, he tapped the paper twice for no, once for yes, and dragged his finger along the lines until Emily saw what he meant. Their evenings became the farm's second shift. She came in after dark, smelling of wet weeds and goat hair. He sat beneath the yellow kitchen light with the old notebooks open. Together, they built the case that nobody outside the house yet believed. By mid-June, the plan had numbers. The goats had cost an average of $41 per head, including hauling. Total purchase and transport, $12,792. First-round medical, mineral, and fencing supplies added $4,860. Death loss and culls were tracked honestly. The stronger market goats were gaining. The best does would stay as a breeding herd. Emily projected that selling 190 head by late summer, even at conservative auction prices, could generate enough to cover the bank's required payment if 2 small brush-clearing contracts came through. Those contracts mattered. Goats alone were risky. Goats as livestock plus land clearing service changed the equation. Emily visited 2 landowners with overgrown creek banks where tractors could not safely work, and chemical spraying was unpopular. She did not sell them a dream. She brought printed photos, paddock records, and a simple price per acre for controlled brush grazing. One landowner signed a small trial agreement for August. Another gave a written letter of intent if Emily's herd held condition through July. For the first time, the plan had cash flow on paper. Then the rain stopped. At first, the county called it a dry spell. Farmers always did. Nobody wants to name a drought too early. But the clouds began missing them. Storms split north and south. Ponds pulled away from their banks. The ground cracked in the open places. By the 4th week, grass in cattle pastures had turned yellow at the roots. By the 6th, hay prices jumped so fast that men who had mocked Emily's goats were calculating how many cows they could afford to keep. The drought lasted 63 days. Cattle farms suffered first. Their animals needed grass, and the grass stopped growing. The hay that remained in barns became too valuable to feed casually. Auction barns filled with early calves and thin cows. Feed store talk changed from jokes to arithmetic. Carter Farm suffered too. Emily hauled water before sunrise and after dark. She shifted rotations to protect recovering grass. She held goats longer in brushier paddocks, where deep-rooted weeds still carried green leaves. She stopped moving them onto tender regrowth too soon, even when it would have been easier. The western pasture did not become lush, nothing did, but it kept offering feed that cattle would not touch. The same weeds people had cursed became drought insurance. Blackberry held leaves after grass browned. Sericea stayed bitter but green. Brush roots reached moisture deeper in the soil. The goats, now stronger and trained to browse, kept eating. They converted rough plants into weight, while other farms burned money on hay. Emily's records became sharper during the drought because the bank deadline was approaching. She photographed the hay receipts she did not have to pay. She compared her feed cost against the county average hay price. She updated weight gains. She collected the signed grazing contract and the second landowner's letter of intent. She printed auction reports from the previous 3 weeks and used the lowest realistic price in her projections, not the highest. When the bank called her in during the 7th week of drought, Emily did not bring only a notebook and hope. She brought a packet. On the first page was the number the bank cared about most, $18,700, due by August 31st. Below it, she showed 3 columns. The first column was what the bank would likely recover if they forced a sale during drought. The western pasture, choked in brush and marked as low-value grazing ground, had been informally valued far below what Warren Pike was willing to admit in public. After legal fees, auction costs, back interest, and the discount every buyer expected from a distressed farm, the bank would not be made whole quickly. It would inherit a fight over rough land in a bad season. The second column was what Carter Farm could produce if the bank gave her 30 days. Projected sale of 190 market goats, using the lowest auction price from the past 3 weeks, $15,960 after fees. Signed brush grazing contract, $2,400. Cull sale already completed, $1,180. Total near-term revenue, $19,540. The third column was next year's projected floor, not built on optimism, but on assets already standing in her pasture. 57 breeding does retained, 3 land clearing leads, 2 with written interest, reduced brush pressure on the western field, lower hay dependence because the goats were eating what cattle had refused, no new borrowing requested. Emily had not asked the loan officer to believe in goats. She had forced him to compare 2 risks. One path gave the bank a distressed piece of land in the middle of a drought, a legal process, and a borrower ruined too soon to repay anything more. The other path gave the bank documented livestock sales, signed service income, a near-term payment, and a farm that had already turned its worst acre into working inventory. The loan officer read slowly. Emily sat across from him with dust on her boots and a sunburn at the edge of her collar. Daniel sat beside her, one hand resting on the folder, his cane leaned against the chair. He did not speak, but when the officer paused at the foreclosure recovery estimate, Daniel moved one finger to the supporting page before Emily could. The old farmer in him was still there, still marking the weak place in a fence. The bank did not grant mercy. It made the colder calculation. 30 days, documented sales, payment of at least $18,700 by the deadline, no new borrowing. For the first time in months, the bank's answer was not no. The next 30 days became a race against heat, debt, and the bodies of animals that had once been too weak to trust. Emily sorted the herd by condition and market readiness. She held back the strongest females. She treated a late parasite flare in one group and adjusted mineral levels after noticing rough coats in another. She repaired the trailer brakes with help from her father's old mechanic, who charged her for parts and quietly forgot to write down all the labor. She confirmed the first grazing contract and moved a small group of goats onto the landowner's creek bank under temporary fence. Every evening, she and Daniel reviewed the numbers. The stroke had changed him, but it had not erased him. Some nights he grew frustrated when his hand would not write what his mind still knew. Emily learned not to rush him. She waited while he formed letters slowly, or pointed to the calculator. The work between them became something deeper than talk. She carried the field into the house. He carried the past into the plan. Together they made the farm less lonely. On sale morning, Emily loaded the market goats before sunrise. These were not the same animals that had stumbled into Carter Farm in April. Their coats had filled in. Their bodies carried weight. Their legs were steady. They fought the chute with bright-eyed stubbornness. Dust rose around them as they moved into the trailer, and Emily found herself remembering every weak step, every treatment, Every night she thought she had made the wrong choice. At the auction, the goats brought more than her conservative estimate. Not a miracle price, not a fantasy. Just enough. The first check covered most of the bank payment. The grazing contract covered the rest. When Emily walked into the bank with the receipt and deposit slip, Daniel came with her. He moved slowly, but he wore his old felt hat for the first time since the stroke. The loan officer stamped the payment received. The sound was small, paper against ink, a hand moving once. But to Emily, it landed like thunder. Carter Farm had survived the deadline. The rain came in September. It started after midnight, soft at first, then steady, washing dust from the tin roof and filling the dark with the smell of wet earth. Emily woke before the alarm and found her father already at the kitchen window, one hand on the sill, watching water run from the porch steps. She stood beside him without turning on the light. Outside, the western pasture took the rain differently than it had in years past. Water did not sheet off bare hard ground in the same angry rush. In the grazed paddocks, broken stems and trampled weeds slowed it. Manure-darkened soil drank where it could. The brush was still there, but opened, weaker, interrupted. Between the thorn clumps, green would have room when spring came. A week later, it did. Small blades first, then clover in the low places. Then native grass Emily had not seen since childhood, appearing in scattered patches like memories returning. The county agent came back in October with a camera and a clipboard, but this time he did not stand at the edge and judge from a distance. He knelt in the pasture and parted the growth with his hands. He studied the stripped rose canes, the returning grass, the manure breaking down into the soil, the shaded ground that had held moisture through drought. Emily walked him through the rotations and showed him where she had made mistakes. She did not polish the story. The losses were in the records. So were the gains. By winter, Carter Farm had changed shape. Emily had sold enough goats to meet the bank deadline and kept the best breeding does. The first 2 brush grazing jobs led to 3 more for the following spring. The north fence was repaired with new posts. The shed roof was patched. The western pasture was still rough, still scarred, still years from what it could become, but it was no longer dead ground on a bank form. It was producing. The people who once laughed began arriving differently. Not in slow-moving trucks with amused faces, but on foot, stopping at the gate after calling ahead, holding caps in their hands, asking how many goats per acre, how long to leave them, how to keep them fenced, how to keep parasites from taking the herd down. Warren Pike came last. He stood by the western fence one cold afternoon, looking over the pasture he had once hoped to buy cheap. Emily did not make him humble himself. She brought out a paddock map and pointed to the brushy draw on his own place where goats could start in May. That was enough. The second spring after the goats arrived, Carter Farm woke under a thin mist. The barn roof no longer leaked over the feed room. The north fence stood straight. New kids slept in straw beneath heat lamps, their ears soft and folded, their mothers shifting carefully around them. Daniel moved slower than before, but he came to the shed every morning, leaning on his cane, checking latches with his good hand, the way he had checked gates all his life. Emily watched him one morning as he stopped at the open shed door. A newborn kid had slipped away from its mother and stood trembling in a stripe of pale sunlight. Its knees shook. Its head bobbed once, then dipped. For a moment, it looked too small for the world it had entered. Daniel lowered himself with effort. Emily stepped forward to help, but he lifted his good hand just enough to stop her. Slowly, bracing one shoulder against the doorframe, he reached down and touched 2 fingers to the kid's back. Not pushing, not holding, only steadying. The kid found its legs. It took one step, then another, crossing the sunlight toward its mother. Daniel stayed bent for a moment, breathing hard. Then he looked past the shed, toward the western pasture where the first green of spring had broken through the scars of last year's brush. His hand moved from the kid's back to the weathered wood of the doorframe, the same hand that had once guided Emily's small fingers around a fence staple. the same hand that now shook when he tried to write. Emily understood then that he was not only touching a newborn goat. He was touching the next version of the farm, not the cattle farm he had lost, not the untouched memory of his father's place, something rougher, smaller, stranger, and still alive. Later that day, Emily carried 3 notebooks to the kitchen table. Her grandfather's pencil records, her father's pasture maps, her own mud-stained pages from the year everyone thought she had lost her mind. She tied them together with a strip of baling twine and placed them in the top drawer of the roll-top desk, where they could be reached. Outside, the hand-painted Carter farm sign had been repaired, not replaced. The old boards still held weather and history. Beneath the family name, Emily had added a smaller line in black paint. Brush into pasture, weeds into worth. People slowed sometimes to read it, but Emily rarely noticed. She was usually in the field by then, moving step-in posts, checking water, and watching goats reach into thorn and leaf and stem with the same steady hunger that had started it all. On quiet evenings, when the sun lowered over the west field, Daniel sat on the porch with the old notebooks beside him. Emily worked the fence line below, her shadow stretching long across the new grass. The goats moved through the brush, tearing green from what everyone else had called useless. Behind them, the pasture stayed open.